Story 1. The Passenger Who Knew Too Much. Daniel Reeves had been driving interstate routes for 19 years, and in that time, he'd developed a simple philosophy about hitchhikers. Never pick them up after dark, and never along routes where cell service disappeared for more than 20 miles at a stretch. But on a freezing February night in 2019, along Interstate 80 through the Nevada desert, Daniel broke both of his rules. The thermometer on his Kenworth's dashboard read 14 degrees when he spotted the figure on the shoulder near mile marker 267. The man stood completely still beside a disabled Honda Civic, both hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, his breath creating clouds in the air, illuminated by Daniel's high beams. What made Daniel slow down wasn't compassion exactly, but rather the calculating knowledge that out here, 60 miles from the nearest town, a stranded motorist could easily freeze to death before morning. Daniel brought the 18-wheeler to a hissing stop about 30 yards past the Honda. Through his side mirror, he watched the man approach with an unhurried gait that seemed oddly confident given his situation. When the passenger door swung open, Daniel got his first clear look at the hitchhiker. The man appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a narrow face and dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His clothes were wrong for the weather. Just a thin jacket over a button-down shirt, no gloves, no hat. "Appreciate this," the man said as he climbed into the cab. His voice was soft, almost melodic. "Car overheated about an hour back. Been waiting for someone to come along." Daniel nodded, already pulling back onto the highway. "You're lucky I came through. This stretch doesn't see much traffic after midnight. Where you headed?" "Wherever you're going is fine," the passenger replied. He settled into the seat with an ease that suggested comfort, even familiarity, with the interior of a long-haul truck. "I'm in no particular hurry." Something about that response unsettled Daniel, though he couldn't articulate why. He focused on the road ahead, where his headlights carved a tunnel through the absolute darkness of the desert night. The white lines of the highway unreeled beneath them in a hypnotic rhythm. For the first 20 minutes they rode in silence. Daniel kept stealing glances at his passenger, who sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead with an expression of serene patience. The man hadn't asked about the heat, hadn't made small talk about the weather, or complained about his situation. He simply existed in the space, as if he'd always been there. "You haul this route often?" the passenger asked suddenly. "3 times a month, usually," Daniel replied. "Been doing it for about 5 years now. Sacramento to Omaha and back." "That's what I thought," the man said, and something in his tone made Daniel's hands tighten on the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" "I mean I've seen your truck before. Blue Kenworth, Nebraska plates ending in 847. You always stop at the Flying J in Winnemucca for fuel. Always around 3 in the morning when you're eastbound." A cold sensation spread through Daniel's chest. "You've been watching me?" "Not watching," the passenger corrected. "Just noticing. You're a creature of habit, Daniel. Every 3rd Monday of the month, give or take a day. Same route, same stops, same schedule." Daniel hadn't mentioned his name. He was certain of that. The introduction had never happened, and his name wasn't visible anywhere in the cab. "How do you know my name?" The passenger smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "It's on your logbook, right there on the dash." Daniel glanced down. His logbook was indeed on the dashboard, but it was closed, and his name appeared only on the inside cover. There was no way the passenger could have seen it from his position. "Look," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but—" "No game," the passenger interrupted. "Just making conversation. You pick up a lot of hitchhikers, Daniel, despite your rules about never doing it after dark." The temperature in the cab seemed to drop several degrees. Daniel's breath became visible in front of his face, even though the heater was running full blast. He reached over and adjusted the temperature controls, cranking them to maximum, but the cold only intensified. "Here's something interesting," the passenger continued, his voice maintaining that unsettling calm. "In about 7 miles, you're going to see a reflective sign for a rest area, green and white, with one of those picnic table symbols. You'll think about stopping there because you need to use the bathroom. You've been holding it since that last fuel stop, haven't you?" Daniel said nothing, but his passenger was correct. His bladder had been pressing for the last 30 miles, but he'd planned to wait until Winnemucca. "You should stop at that rest area," the passenger said. "You really should." "I'll stop when I'm ready to stop," Daniel replied, his voice harder now. The fear that had been building in his chest was beginning to transform into anger. "And when I do, you're getting out. I don't care if you freeze. This was a mistake." "Was it?" The passenger turned to look at Daniel directly for the first time since entering the cab. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, his eyes appeared completely black, like polished stones. Or was it exactly what was supposed to happen? The rest area sign appeared in the headlights exactly as predicted. Daniel saw it and felt his foot instinctively ease off the accelerator. He caught himself immediately and pressed down harder, determined not to give this strange man the satisfaction of being right. "You're not stopping," the passenger observed. "That's different." "Different from what?" "From the other times." Daniel's blood turned to ice water. "What other times? What the hell are you talking about?" The passenger reached into his jacket pocket, and Daniel tensed, preparing for a weapon. Instead, the man pulled out a small, weathered photograph and held it up to the dashboard light. Daniel's eyes flicked to it, and what he saw made him nearly swerve off the road. The photograph showed Daniel's truck, the same blue Kenworth, parked at the rest area they'd just passed. In the picture, the passenger door was open, and 2 figures were visible: Daniel himself, and the man sitting beside him now. But something was wrong with the image. The trees in the background weren't bare, as they were now in February, but full of leaves. And Daniel was wearing a different shirt, a red flannel he distinctly remembered packing away for the summer because the left sleeve had torn. "This was taken in September," the passenger said. "The first time you picked me up." "That's impossible. I've never seen you before tonight." "Haven't you?" The passenger tucked the photograph away. "Think carefully, Daniel. Think about the other times you've driven this route. The times when you arrived at your destination 3 or 4 hours later than your logbook says you should have. The times when you found items in your cab that you didn't remember buying. That coffee mug from a truck stop you're certain you never visited. Those receipts from restaurants in towns you swear you never stopped in." Daniel's mouth went dry. He had experienced exactly those things, multiple times over the past year. He'd chalked it up to exhaustion, to the mental fog that came from too many hours behind the wheel. But hearing them listed so precisely by this stranger made them feel sinister, like evidence of something he'd been deliberately avoiding acknowledging. "Every 3rd Monday," the passenger continued, "you drive this route, and somewhere between mile marker 267 and Winnemucca, you lose time. 3 hours, sometimes 4. And you can't account for them, can you?" "Stop it," Daniel said, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "The first time, you stopped at that rest area. You thought you'd use the bathroom, stretch your legs. I was already there, waiting by the entrance to the facilities. You asked me if I needed help, and I said yes. I said I needed a ride. And you, being the decent man you sometimes are, said you'd take me as far as Winnemucca. Do you remember what happened next, Daniel?" Daniel's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. A memory was trying to surface, something buried deep and wrapped in the cotton wool of deliberate forgetting. He saw himself pulling into a rest area, saw the sodium lights creating pools of orange in the darkness, saw a figure standing near the bathroom building. "We talked," the passenger said. "You told me about your daughter, Sarah, about how she died in that car accident 3 years ago, about how you blame yourself because you'd been texting her when she crashed. You were asking her what she wanted you to bring home for dinner, and she was texting back when she ran the red light. Do you remember telling me that?" Tears were streaming down Daniel's face now. He hadn't told anyone about the texting, not even his wife. It was his secret shame, the knowledge that his daughter had died, because he'd wanted to know if she preferred chicken or beef for dinner. "And do you know what I told you?" the passenger continued. "I told you that I could help you forget. I told you that every third Monday, when you drive this route and pick me up, I can take away 3 or 4 hours of your grief. I can make it so that for that brief window of time, Sarah's death doesn't exist for you." And you said yes. You've been saying yes for 11 months now, Daniel. This is the 13th time. The highway ahead began to blur, not from tears, but because reality itself seemed to be softening, like a watercolor painting left in the rain. The white lines of the road started to shimmer and wave, and the darkness beyond the headlights took on a texture, a depth that suggested it was not merely the absence of light, but rather a substance, a physical thing pressing in on all sides. "What are you?" Daniel managed to ask. "Does it matter?" The passenger's voice had changed, becoming layered, as if multiple versions of him were speaking simultaneously. "You've been using me as much as I've been using you. Every time we make this drive together, you get a few hours of peace, and I get a few hours of your time. Fair trade, wouldn't you say? What happens during those hours? What do you do with my time?" The passenger was silent for a long moment. Outside, the desert landscape was transforming. Instead of the flat, scrubby terrain Daniel knew should be there, he could see structures rising from the sand. Impossible buildings made of shadow and geometry that hurt to look at directly. The road beneath them was no longer asphalt, but something that resembled glass or ice, reflecting a sky that held too many stars. "I borrow it," the passenger finally said. "Time is a currency, Daniel, a precious one. And there are those of us who've learned to trade in it. You had so much grief, so much weight in your present moments. I simply redistributed it, borrowed some of your hours when the grief was light or absent, and in exchange gave you relief from the hours when it was crushing you." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to deny that he'd ever agreed to such a thing, but deep down, he knew it was true. He remembered now, in fragments, pulling into that rest area 11 months ago, meeting this man, being offered a bargain that seemed too good to refuse. 3 hours of not feeling the guilt and loss that had been suffocating him since Sarah's death. What would any father give for that? "The problem," the passenger said, and now his voice carried a note of regret, "is that debts must be settled. You've borrowed 39 hours of peace from me, Daniel, and tonight the terms of our agreement change. What do you mean? I mean that tonight, you didn't stop at the rest area. Tonight, you broke the pattern. And when you break a pattern in time, when you deviate from the agreed-upon path, there are consequences. The truck was no longer moving forward, Daniel realized. Despite the fact that the engine was still running and his speedometer showed 71 miles per hour, they weren't covering any actual distance. The same stretch of impossible highway repeated endlessly ahead of them. The same shadow structures sliding past on both sides in an eternal loop. What happens now? Daniel asked, though he was terrified of the answer. The passenger turned to face him fully, and Daniel saw that he no longer resembled a man at all. The thing beside him was a hollowness shaped like a person, a void in the fabric of reality, wearing the memory of a human face. Now, it said, you pay back what you borrowed. 39 hours of your time, all at once. You'll live them here, in this space between the moments. And when you're finally released back into your normal timeline, you'll arrive at Winnemucca exactly when you should, exactly on schedule. No lost time to puzzle over, no mysterious gaps in your memory. But what will happen to me during those hours? Daniel's voice was barely audible over the roar of the engine. You'll experience every second of the grief I took from you. All 39 hours of it, condensed and purified and unrelenting. You wanted to forget, Daniel. You wanted relief from the weight of your daughter's death. But grief is not meant to be escaped. It's meant to be carried, to be integrated, to be survived. By giving it to me, you only delayed the inevitable. The thing that had been a passenger reached out and placed one hand on Daniel's shoulder. Its touch was impossibly cold, and where it made contact, Daniel felt something essential begin to drain out of him. Time, he realized. It was taking time from him, hour by hour, moment by moment. The last thing Daniel thought before his consciousness dissolved into a sea of unprocessed grief was that he should never have picked up that hitchhiker. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was a lie. Given the same choice, the same crushing weight of guilt and loss, he would have made the same decision every time. When Daniel's awareness finally returned, he was pulling into the parking lot of the Flying J in Winnemucca. According to his dashboard clock, it was 3:14 in the morning, exactly when he should be arriving based on his logbook. His bladder was painfully full, and his face was sticky with dried tears. The passenger seat beside him was empty, and had been for some time, judging by the way it looked undisturbed, as if no one had sat there in hours. But on the dashboard, placed neatly beside his logbook, was a weathered photograph. It showed Daniel's truck, parked at a rest area, the door open, 2 figures visible in the frame. Daniel picked it up with trembling fingers and studied it in the dim light of the parking lot. In the photograph, both figures were clearly visible, Daniel and the hitchhiker. But something had changed. The hitchhiker was walking away, his back to the camera, his form already beginning to dissolve into the darkness of the desert night. And Daniel, the Daniel in the photograph, was sitting in the driver's seat with his hands over his face, shoulders shaking with sobs. Daniel tucked the photograph into his logbook and climbed down from the cab. His legs felt weak, and his head throbbed with the remnants of the worst emotional pain he'd ever experienced. But underneath that pain, he felt something else, a strange sense of lightness, as if a weight he'd been carrying had finally, truly been set down. He never saw the hitchhiker again on his drives through Nevada. But sometimes, late at night, when the road stretched empty before him, Daniel would catch himself looking at the shoulder, near mile marker 2167. half expecting to see that figure standing there in the darkness. And whenever that happened, he would tighten his grip on the steering wheel and press down harder on the accelerator, driving past without slowing down, determined never again to make a bargain with something that traded in hours and grief. But in his quieter moments, Daniel couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever truly stopped making that trade, or if somewhere in the spaces between seconds, the passenger was still there, still waiting, still collecting the interest on a debt that could never be fully repaid. Story 2. The Road That Disappeared. Marcus Chen had been driving for Elite Transport for 7 years, and in that time, he'd logged over 800,000 miles across 43 states. He prided himself on knowing the roads, on understanding the rhythms of the highways, like other people understood music. So when he picked up the Hitchhiker on Highway 50 in rural Kansas, and the road itself began to disappear, Marcus knew something was fundamentally wrong with reality. It started on a humid June evening in 2021. Marcus was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Wichita to Denver, a route he'd driven dozens of times before. The sun was setting behind him, painting the wheat fields in shades of copper and gold, when he spotted the woman standing beside a broken-down Subaru Outback near the intersection of Highway 50 and County Road 18. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her clothes suggested someone passing through rather than someone local. Designer jeans, expensive hiking boots, a North Face jacket despite the 80-degree temperature. Her car's hood was up, and she was staring at the engine with the bewildered expression of someone who couldn't tell a carburetor from a transmission. Marcus pulled his Peterbilt onto the shoulder, about 50 feet past her car, and climbed down from the cab. His CB radio had been silent for the past hour, which was unusual for this route. Usually there was steady chatter from other truckers, but tonight the airwaves were empty except for static. "Need some help?" Marcus called out as he approached. The woman looked up, and Marcus noticed her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. "Thank God," she said. "I think it's the alternator, maybe." The battery light came on about 20 miles back, and then everything just died. "My phone has no signal out here." Marcus looked at the engine. He was no mechanic, but he could tell that the alternator belt was intact, and the battery connections looked solid. Without proper tools, there wasn't much he could do. "I can give you a ride to the next town," he offered. "There's a truck stop about 40 miles east in Cimarron. They'll have a tow service." The woman hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Stay with her car in the growing darkness, or accept a ride from a stranger. Marcus understood the calculation. He pulled out his wallet and showed her his commercial driver's license, his Elite Transport ID badge, and a family photo of himself with his wife and 2 daughters. "I'm Marcus Chen. Been driving trucks for 7 years, never had an accident or complaint. I've got 2 daughters about your age. I promise you'll be safe." Something in his voice or demeanor must have convinced her, because she nodded and grabbed a backpack from her car. "I'm Emily Morrison, and thank you. I was starting to think I'd be out here all night." They climbed into the cab, and Marcus pulled back onto Highway 50. The sunset had deepened into twilight, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The wheat fields on either side of the road swayed in a breeze that Marcus couldn't feel, creating waves of motion that rolled to the horizon. "You're a long way from anywhere," Marcus observed. "What brings you out to this part of Kansas?" Emily settled into the passenger seat and fastened her seatbelt. "I'm a photographer. Landscape work, mostly. I've been driving around the Midwest looking for interesting compositions. Wide open spaces, abandoned farms, that kind of thing. Find what you were looking for? Actually, yes. There's this incredible abandoned grain elevator about 30 miles back. Perfect light, amazing textures. I got some shots that I think might make it into my portfolio. She paused, then added, though I'd trade them all right now for a working car. Marcus smiled. Well, we'll get you sorted out. Cimarron's a small town, but the truck stop there is pretty good. They'll be able to arrange a tow. For the next 10 minutes, they made small talk. Emily told him about her photography career, about the gallery show she was trying to prepare for. Marcus talked about his job, about the satisfaction of delivering cargo on time, about the beauty of watching the country roll past at 65 miles per hour. It was pleasant, normal conversation, the kind that helped pass the time on a long haul. Then Marcus noticed something odd. His GPS, which had been showing their location clearly, suddenly displayed no signal. The screen flickered, showed static for a moment, then went completely dark. At the same time, his odometer stopped advancing. They were still moving. He could feel the engine's vibration, could see the landscape sliding past. But according to his instruments, they weren't covering any distance. That's weird, Marcus muttered, tapping the GPS screen. Nothing happened. What's wrong? Emily asked. GPS just died, and my odometer stopped. He glanced at the fuel gauge and felt a cold prickle of unease. The needle was dropping, steadily moving toward empty despite the fact that he'd filled up less than an hour ago and should have 3/4 of a tank remaining. Emily leaned forward to look at the dashboard. Is that normal? No, none of this is normal. Marcus grabbed his CB radio microphone. This is elite transport driver Marcus Chen on Highway 50 eastbound. Anybody copy? Static was his only answer. He tried again, switching channels, but every frequency gave him nothing but white noise. The landscape outside was changing. The wheat fields were still there, still swaying in that unfelt breeze, but they seemed to extend farther than they should. Marcus knew this stretch of highway. There should be farmhouses visible every mile or so, occasional clusters of trees, irrigation equipment. But now there was nothing but wheat, unbroken golden waves stretching to a horizon that seemed to be receding as they drove toward it. Marcus, Emily said, and her voice carried a note of fear that made his stomach clench. Look at the road. Marcus looked ahead and felt reality tilt sideways. The highway in front of them was narrowing. Not gradually, but visibly, the 2-lane road shrinking as they drove. The asphalt pulling in from the sides like a puddle drying in the sun. The white lines marking the lanes were warping, bending toward each other, and the yellow center line had begun to spiral, creating a dizzying pattern that hurt to look at directly. What the hell? Marcus's foot automatically moved toward the brake, but he didn't press it. Some instinct told him that stopping might be worse than continuing. Have you ever seen anything like this? No. Emily's voice was barely a whisper. This isn't possible. Roads they don't do this. The narrowing continued. The road that had been wide enough for 2 lanes of traffic was now barely the width of Marcus's truck. The wheat fields on either side had crept closer, and now the tall stalks were brushing against the sides of the trailer, creating a constant whisper-scrape sound that set Marcus's teeth on edge. His side mirrors showed something that made his breath catch. Behind them, where Highway 50 should have stretched back toward Wichita, there was nothing. The road had simply ceased to exist, replaced by unbroken wheat fields. It was as if the highway was being erased behind them, consumed by the endless farmland, leaving them on an ever-shrinking strip of asphalt, with nowhere to go but forward. "We need to turn around," Emily said, her voice rising with panic. "There's nothing to turn around to," Marcus replied, pointing at the mirrors. "Look, the road behind us is gone." Emily twisted in her seat to look out the back window. Her face went pale. "That's impossible. We just drove on that road. It was there 2 minutes ago." "I know." Marcus's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was experiencing. This couldn't be real. Roads didn't disappear. Physics didn't work like this. But the evidence was undeniable, reflected in his mirrors and visible through every window. They were trapped on a narrowing band of highway that was vanishing behind them and shrinking ahead of them. The sun, which should have fully set by now, was stuck on the horizon, a bloated orange disk that neither rose nor fell, but simply hung in the sky like a watchful eye. The stars overhead were wrong too. Marcus didn't know much about astronomy, but he knew that stars didn't move, didn't rearrange themselves into new patterns as you watched. Yet that's exactly what they were doing, sliding across the firmament in slow, deliberate motions that suggested intelligence rather than cosmic randomness. "Your phone," Marcus said suddenly. "Check your phone. Take a picture of this." Emily fumbled in her pocket and pulled out an iPhone. She raised it to photograph the narrowing road ahead, then lowered it with a confused expression. "It's not working. The camera app opens, but the screen just shows static, like old TV static. Try calling someone. Try 911. She tapped at the screen, held the phone to her ear, then shook her head. Nothing. Not even a dial tone. Just silence. The road was now barely 6 feet wide, just enough for Marcus's truck to fit if he kept it perfectly centered. The wheat on either side rose higher than it should, the stalks now reaching up to the windows of the cab, creating walls of golden grain that blocked any view beyond them. The sound of them scraping against metal was constant, maddening. "What's happening to us?" Emily's voice broke on the last word. Marcus wanted to give her a reassuring answer, wanted to tell her that there was a logical explanation, that they'd figure it out. But he had nothing. This was beyond his experience, beyond anything he'd imagined possible. They were trapped in some kind of impossible situation, and he had no idea how to escape it. Then he saw the sign. It emerged from the wheat ahead, a standard green highway sign, but the text on it made his blood run cold. Instead of showing distances to nearby towns, it displayed a single message in white letters. "There is no Cimarron ahead. There is no behind. There is only the road, and the road is ending." "Did you see that?" Emily's voice was tight with terror. "I saw it." Marcus's hands were locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The road ahead was now less than 4 feet wide. His trailer was scraping against the wheat on both sides, creating a terrible grinding sound that suggested metal being torn away. Another sign appeared. "Why did you stop? Why did you pick her up?" "What does that mean?" Emily demanded. "What is it talking about?" Marcus didn't answer, because he was suddenly remembering something. Before he'd stopped to help Emily, he'd been thinking about his brother, his younger brother, David, who died 5 years ago. David had been hitchhiking through Colorado, trying to find himself after dropping out of college, when he'd been hit by a drunk driver on a dark mountain road. The driver had never stopped, never been caught. David had died alone on the side of the highway, waiting for help that came too late. Marcus had always felt guilty about that. He'd been the older brother, the responsible one. He should have convinced David to stay in school, should have driven out to Colorado to bring him home. He'd failed his brother, and the guilt had eaten at him for 5 years. Is that why he always stopped for hitchhikers now? Was it some kind of penance, some attempt to make up for not being there when David needed him? "Marcus!" Emily's shout pulled him back to the present. The road ahead was now just a narrow strip, barely 3 feet wide. His truck wouldn't fit. They were going to hit the wheat, going to crash, and... The road ended. Not gradually, not with any warning signs or barriers. It simply stopped, as if someone had taken scissors to the fabric of reality and cut it away. Beyond the end of the road was nothing. Not wheat, not darkness, but absolute nothingness. A void that Marcus's eyes couldn't comprehend or focus on. Marcus slammed on the brakes. The truck's air brakes engaged with a hiss, and they came to a stop with the front bumper of the Peterbilt inches from the edge of oblivion. Through the windshield, Marcus stared into the nothing and felt his mind threatening to shut down rather than process what he was seeing. "What do we do?" Emily whispered. "What do we do?" Before Marcus could answer, a figure stepped out of the wheat. It was tall, impossibly tall, with proportions that were almost human, but subtly wrong. Its skin, if it could be called skin, seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. It had no face, or rather, it had too many faces, dozens of them flickering across the surface of its head, each one distinct for a moment before melting into the next. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once. From the CB radio, from Emily's phone, from the wheat itself. "You stopped," it said. "You broke the pattern. You interfered." "I don't understand," Marcus managed to say. "She was meant to die," the thing said, and one of its flickering faces resolved into Emily's before melting away. "Tonight, on Highway 50, her alternator was meant to fail, her battery to die, her phone to have no signal. She was meant to walk for miles in the dark until exhaustion and exposure claimed her. That was the pattern. That was the design." "That's insane," Marcus said. "You're saying she was supposed to die, and because I picked her up, reality is breaking down." "Not breaking down. Correcting. This," the thing gestured at the narrowing road, the void, the impossible wheat, "is what happens when someone disrupts the pattern. The timeline tries to heal itself, to force events back toward their intended conclusion." Emily was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "I was going to die? Tonight?" "Yes." The thing turned its flowing attention to her. "But you were saved. By him. By Marcus, who stops for every hitchhiker he sees, who tries to make up for his brother's death by ensuring no one else dies alone on the roadside. His guilt changed your fate." "So what now?" Marcus demanded. "What happens to us?" The thing was silent for a long moment. Around them, the wheat began to move, in ways that wheat shouldn't move, the stalks bending and writhing like tentacles. The void ahead grew larger, expanding slowly toward them, eating away at the narrow strip of road beneath the truck. "Now," the thing said, "there are choices. Emily Morrison can die, as she was meant to. Marcus Chen can continue his route, arriving in Denver on schedule, with no memory of tonight. The pattern will heal. Reality will stabilize." "Or," Marcus asked, because he could hear the unspoken alternative in the thing's voice, "or Emily Morrison can live, but the debt must be paid. A life for a life. Someone must die on Highway 50 tonight. Someone must fulfill the pattern that was disrupted." The implication was clear, and Marcus felt his stomach turn over. "You're saying I have to die to save her?" "Not have to. Choose to. Free will is the one variable that even we cannot fully predict or control. You may choose to die. You may choose to let her die. Or you may choose neither, and simply wait here as the void consumes you both. 3 options, Marcus Chen. Choose quickly. The correction is accelerating. Marcus looked at Emily, at her terrified face, at the tears streaking her cheeks. She was so young, barely older than his daughters. She had her whole life ahead of her, a career she was passionate about, photographs she wanted to take, galleries she wanted to exhibit in. His brother had been young too, full of potential, and he'd died alone on a roadside because no one had stopped to help. Marcus had spent 5 years feeling guilty, 5 years stopping for every hitchhiker, every stranded motorist. And now he understood that it had all led to this moment, to this choice. This was his chance to actually save someone, to make up for the brother he'd lost, to turn his guilt into something meaningful. "Marcus, no," Emily said, reading his expression. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare do this. I have daughters," Marcus said quietly. "I have a wife. But you know what? They'll understand. They'll grieve, but they'll understand." He turned to the thing of flowing mercury and infinite faces. "Take me. Let her live. That's my choice. Marcus, please." "It's done," the thing said, and reached forward with a hand that had too many fingers. The last thing Marcus felt was cold, a deep, penetrating cold that started where the thing touched his chest and spread through his body like frost forming on glass. The last thing he saw was Emily's face, twisted with anguish and guilt and gratitude. The last thing he heard was the thing's voice, softer now, almost gentle. "You paid your brother's debt. You can rest now." When Emily Morrison came to, she was sitting in her Subaru Outback on the shoulder of Highway 50. Her engine was running, her phone had full signal, and the sun was just beginning to set. She felt disoriented, confused, as if waking from a vivid dream. She grabbed her phone and checked the news, searching for any mention of accidents on Highway 50, any reports of a trucker named Marcus Chen. There was nothing. It was as if he'd never existed. But in her backpack, tucked between her camera and her water bottle, she found something that proved it had been real. A commercial driver's license, belonging to Marcus Chen, Elite Transport. And beneath it, a handwritten note in handwriting that wasn't hers. "Live well. Make the photographs that matter. You are worth saving." Emily never learned what happened to Marcus's family, whether they remembered him or whether reality had been rewritten to exclude his existence entirely. But she kept his license with her always, a reminder that someone had chosen to die so that she could live. And every photograph she took after that night, every image she captured, was dedicated to his memory, to the man who had paid a debt that wasn't his and saved a stranger from a fate she never knew was coming. Story 3. The Hitchhiker Who Wouldn't Leave. Robert Bobby Milstein had a strict policy about hitchhikers. He picked them up only when it felt right, when some indefinable instinct told him the person was safe. In his 12 years of driving cross-country routes, this instinct had never failed him. He'd given rides to college students, traveling musicians, people down on their luck, and they'd all been exactly what they appeared to be: ordinary people needing help. But on a rainy October night in 2018, on State Route 20 through upstate New York, Bobby's instinct failed him spectacularly. The hitchhiker was standing under a broken streetlight near the entrance to a closed rest area, about 40 miles west of Albany. He was middle-aged, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and a well-worn leather jacket that glistened with rain. What struck Bobby as unusual was the man's posture, perfectly relaxed, as if he'd been expecting Bobby specifically, and wasn't surprised to see his rig approaching. Bobby slowed his freightliner and pulled onto the shoulder. Through the rain-streaked window, he made eye contact with the hitchhiker, and something in those eyes, a clarity, a directness, convinced him that this was safe. His instinct, that mysterious sixth sense, gave him the green light. "Where you headed?" Bobby called out, as the man climbed into the cab, bringing with him the smell of rain and something else, something Bobby couldn't quite identify. It was organic, but not unpleasant, like wet earth or autumn leaves. "Wherever you're going," the hitchhiker replied. His voice was smooth, cultured, with an accent Bobby couldn't place. "I'm in no particular rush." Bobby pulled back onto Route 20, windshield wipers working steadily against the downpour. "Well, I'm going to Syracuse tonight, then on to Buffalo tomorrow morning. That work for you?" "Perfect," the hitchhiker said, settling into the passenger seat with an ease that suggested familiarity with truck cabs. "My name is Thomas, by the way. Thomas Crane. Bobby Milstein. Pleased to meet you." For the first hour, they talked about normal things. Thomas asked about Bobby's work, his family, his years on the road. Bobby found himself opening up more than usual, telling stories about his kids, about the business he was saving to start when he retired, about his late father, who'd also been a trucker. Thomas was an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions, offering insightful observations. It wasn't until they were approaching the exit for Syracuse that Bobby realized something was wrong. "This is my exit coming up," Bobby said, flipping on his turn signal. "There's a truck stop just off the interstate where I usually park for the night. They've got a diner if you want to grab something to eat before you figure out your next ride." "Why would I need another ride?" Thomas asked. Bobby glanced over, confused. "Well, because I'm stopping for the night. Syracuse is my endpoint today." "No," Thomas said calmly. "No, I don't think so. I think you're going to keep driving. Look, I appreciate your confidence, but I've been on the road for 11 hours. I need to stop, log my rest hours. It's the law." Thomas smiled, and Bobby felt a chill run down his spine. There was something off about that smile, something that didn't quite reach the man's eyes. "Bobby, you're going to keep driving because I need you to keep driving. We're not done yet." "Listen, buddy, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but—" Bobby's words died as his hands locked on the steering wheel. He tried to move them, tried to lift his foot from the accelerator, but his body wouldn't respond. He watched in horror as his own traitorous hand reached out and turned off the turn signal, and his truck continued past the Syracuse exit without slowing. "What are you doing to me?" Bobby's voice came out strangled, panicked. "I'm not doing anything," Thomas said pleasantly. "You're doing this. Your body knows what it needs to do. It's just your conscious mind that's confused." Bobby fought against the invisible force controlling his movements, but it was useless. His hands maintained their grip on the wheel, his foot stayed pressed on the accelerator, and the truck continued eastward on Route 20, away from Syracuse, away from his planned stop, into the rainy darkness. "Why are you doing this?" Bobby demanded. Thomas shifted in his seat to face Bobby more directly. "Because, Bobby, you're the 14th, and the 14th is special. The 14th is the one who completes the pattern." "The 14th what?" "I don't understand." "Driver," Thomas said simply. "You're the 14th driver who's picked me up. The first was in 1987. A man named Richard Koss, driving through Oregon. Sweet man, very kind. He died of a heart attack 3 weeks after he dropped me off. Natural causes, nothing suspicious. Bobby's blood ran cold. You're telling me you've been hitchhiking for over 30 years? Oh, much longer than that. But yes, in this particular form, for about 31 years. And each driver who picks me up, each person who shows me that particular kindness, becomes part of the pattern. The first was Richard. The second was a woman named Angela Torres in 1989. The third was, well, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're the 14th. And the 14th is when the pattern completes itself. I don't believe in patterns. I don't believe in any of this supernatural nonsense. Thomas laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. You don't have to believe in it, Bobby. Gravity works whether you believe in it or not. The pattern is the same way. Bobby tried again to move his hands, to press the brake, but his body remained stubbornly unresponsive. They were leaving Syracuse behind now, driving into increasingly rural territory. The rain had intensified, and visibility was down to maybe 50 feet. The road ahead was a tunnel of darkness, punctuated by the weak glow of occasional streetlights. "Where are we going?" Bobby asked. "To the place where it began," Thomas replied. "Where I began, in this form. It's a farmhouse, about 70 miles from here. Abandoned now, but it's still standing. That's where the pattern will complete." "And what happens when the pattern completes?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been sadness. "I'm released. And you, well, you take my place." The full horror of the situation crashed down on Bobby. "You mean I'll become like you, hitchhiking for decades, cursing drivers, trapping them in some kind of supernatural pattern?" "Not cursing," Thomas corrected. "Just existing. And yes, that's exactly what you'll become. Until you find your 14th, and then you'll be released, and the cycle will continue. It's been going on for a very long time, Bobby. Centuries, perhaps. I don't know where it started or why. I only know that I'm tired, so very tired, and tonight it ends for me." Bobby felt tears of frustration and fear streaming down his face. "Please, please don't do this. I have kids. I have a wife. They need me." Richard had kids too. So did Angela and Michael and Sandra and all the others. They all had people who needed them. But they all picked me up, Bobby. They all showed me kindness when they could have driven past. And kindness, unfortunately, is what fuels the pattern. Your good deed is going to damn you. The miles rolled by in nightmarish silence. Bobby tried everything he could think of to regain control of his body. Screaming, crying, pleading, threatening. Nothing worked. His body continued to drive, mechanically following Route 20 deeper into rural New York, while his mind screamed inside his skull like a prisoner in a locked cell. They turned off Route 20 onto a series of progressively smaller roads. State highways becoming county roads, becoming dirt tracks. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and through breaks in the clouds, Bobby could see a 3/4 moon hanging low in the sky, casting everything in silver light. Finally, they turned onto a long driveway overgrown with weeds. At the end of it stood a farmhouse, exactly as Thomas had described. Abandoned, windows broken, roof sagging, but still standing. Bobby's truck came to a stop in front of it, and the engine shut off. "Come on," Thomas said, opening his door. "Let's get this over with." Bobby found that he could move again, but only to follow Thomas out of the truck and toward the farmhouse. His legs carried him forward against his will, his feet crunching on gravel and broken glass as they approached the front door. Inside, The house was worse than Bobby had imagined. It had clearly been abandoned for decades. The wallpaper hung in strips, the floorboards were rotten in places, and everywhere there was the smell of mold and decay. Thomas led him through rooms filled with the detritus of someone else's life. Water-damaged furniture, broken dishes, photographs so faded they were barely visible. They climbed a staircase that groaned under their weight and entered what must have once been a bedroom. The walls here were different from the rest of the house. They were covered in writing, thousands of names scratched or written or burned into the plaster. Bobby stepped closer and realized with growing horror that these were names and dates. Richard Koss, 1987. Angela Torres, 1989. Michael Brennan, 1992. 13 names, 13 dates, 13 drivers who had picked up Thomas Crane and been cursed for their kindness. "This is where it happens," Thomas said softly. "This is where I become free, and you become bound." Bobby wanted to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He watched as Thomas pulled a knife from his jacket. Not a threatening weapon, just a simple pocket knife. Thomas used it to scratch into the plaster. Robert Milstein, 2018. The moment the final number was carved, Bobby felt something change. It was like a circuit completing, like a lock clicking open. A wave of cold swept through the room, so intense that his breath misted in front of his face. The names on the wall began to glow with a faint green light, pulsing in rhythm with Bobby's heartbeat. Thomas stumbled backward, and Bobby saw that he was changing. His skin was becoming more translucent, his form less substantial. He looked at his hands with an expression of wonder and relief. "It's done," Thomas whispered. "It's finally done. I'm sorry, Bobby. I'm so sorry. But I've been carrying this for 31 years, and I couldn't do it anymore." "You're a monster," Bobby said, finding his voice at last. "You ruined 13 lives before mine. How can you live with that?" "I don't have to live with it anymore," Thomas replied. His form was barely visible now, like smoke or fog. "That's the point. And someday, when you find your 14th, you'll understand. You'll understand how heavy the years get, how the loneliness eats away at you, how the need for release becomes the only thing that matters." "I'll never do what you did," Bobby swore. "I'll never trap someone else in this nightmare." Thomas's laugh was sad and knowing. "That's what I said too. That's what we all say. But you'll see. Give it 10 years, give it 20. Eventually you'll be standing in some other abandoned place with your 14th victim, and you'll scratch their name into a wall, and you'll feel nothing but relief." With those final words, Thomas Crane vanished completely, leaving Bobby alone in the ruined bedroom with 13 glowing names, and his own name scratched at the bottom of the list. Bobby tried to leave the house, but he found he couldn't. Some force kept him within the property boundaries, as invisible and implacable as whatever had controlled his body in the truck. He tried to call for help, but his phone had no signal. He tried to drive away, but his truck wouldn't start. Days passed, or what felt like days. Bobby lost track of time in the abandoned farmhouse. He didn't get hungry or thirsty, didn't need to sleep. He simply existed, trapped, waiting for something he didn't understand. And then, on what must have been the 3rd or 4th night, he heard a vehicle approaching. Bobby rushed to the window and saw headlights turning into the driveway. A pickup truck, old and battered, pulling up in front of the farmhouse. Without consciously deciding to, Bobby found himself walking out of the house, down the front steps, toward the driver's side window. A man sat behind the wheel, maybe 40 years old, with weathered features and kind eyes. "You okay?" the man called out. "I saw your rig here when I was hunting earlier today. Thought maybe you were in trouble." Bobby opened his mouth to warn the man, to tell him to drive away and never come back. But the words that came out were different, controlled by something that was no longer entirely Bobby. "My truck broke down," Bobby heard himself say. "Any chance you could give me a ride to the nearest town?" The man hesitated, clearly weighing whether to help a stranger in an isolated location. Then he unlocked his passenger door. "Sure thing. Hop in." As Bobby climbed into the truck, he felt a terrible understanding wash over him. This was how it worked. This was the pattern. He would ride with this man, this good Samaritan, and somewhere along the way, he would become Thomas, would hijack the man's will, would eventually lead him to this farmhouse or some other cursed location. And the man's name would become number 15 on a list that would keep growing until Bobby found his own 14th victim decades from now. The pattern would continue, just as it had continued for centuries before Thomas, before Richard Koss, before whoever had been the first victim, in a chain that stretched back into history's darkest corners. Bobby wanted to scream, to fight, to resist. But as the truck pulled away from the farmhouse and back onto the country road, he felt his consciousness being pushed deeper inside himself, felt something else, something ancient and hungry and patient, rising to take control. The last coherent thought Bobby Milstein had, before he became something that was no longer quite Bobby Milstein, was that he should never have trusted his instinct. He should have driven past the hitchhiker in the rain. He should have known that sometimes the worst monsters are the ones who look like they need help. But it was too late for should-haves. The pattern had claimed him, and somewhere deep inside what remained of his consciousness, Bobby knew that he would be riding these roads for a very, very long time. Story 4. The Last Stop Diner. Jennifer Jen Coe had been hauling freight for Midwest distribution for 8 years, and in that time, she'd developed an encyclopedic knowledge of truck stops, diners, and rest areas across the continental United States. She knew which places had the best coffee, which ones had clean showers, which ones to avoid because of bad lighting or strange clientele. But on a cold November night in 2020, she stopped at a diner that wasn't in any of her mental catalogs, and that stop changed everything. She was driving south on Highway 59 through Oklahoma, hauling a load of furniture from Kansas City to Houston. It was just past midnight, and she'd been on the road for 9 hours. Her eyes were starting to burn with fatigue, and she knew she needed to stop soon. That's when she saw the hitchhiker. He was young, maybe 19 or 20, standing beside a disabled motorcycle on the shoulder of the highway. Even from a distance, Jen could see he was shivering in the cold November wind. He wore a denim jacket that was clearly insufficient for the 40-degree temperature, and his motorcycle, an old Honda from the looks of it, had its front wheel at an unnatural angle, suggesting something broken in the suspension. Jen had a general policy against picking up hitchhikers, but something about the kid's situation triggered her maternal instincts. She had a son about that age, a college student in Oregon. She'd want someone to help him if he were stranded on a highway in the middle of the night. She pulled over 50 yards past the motorcycle and climbed down from her Volvo rig. The kid jogged up to her, relief evident on his face. "Thank God," he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I've been out here for 2 hours. My phone's dead, and nobody's stopped." "What happened?" Jen asked, nodding toward the motorcycle. "Hit a pothole about 3 miles back. Something in the front suspension gave way. I managed to limp here, but she's done. No way I'm riding her tonight." Jen studied him for a moment. He had honest eyes, the kind of open, earnest expression her son had. He didn't set off any of her internal alarm bells. "I can give you a ride to the next town," she offered. "Probably take you an hour or two to arrange a tow from there." The kid's face lit up. "That would be amazing. Thank you so much. I'm Tyler, by the way. Tyler Vance. Jenko, let's get you warmed up." Tyler grabbed a backpack from the disabled motorcycle, and they climbed into the cab of Jen's rig. She cranked the heat up, and Tyler held his hands in front of the vents, sighing with relief as warmth flooded the cabin. For the first 20 miles, they made easy conversation. Tyler was a student at Oklahoma State, heading home to visit his family for Thanksgiving break. He'd been riding since sunset, trying to save money on gas by taking back roads instead of the interstate. The motorcycle had been a gift from his grandfather, passed down through 3 generations, and Tyler was devastated that he'd broken it. "It can be fixed," Jen assured him. "Bikes like that, they're made to be repaired. It's not like modern stuff that's all computerized. Find a good mechanic, it'll ride again." "I hope so," Tyler said quietly. "My grandfather would kill me if he knew I wrecked his bike." They were approaching a small town called Latimer. Population maybe 3,000, according to the faded welcome sign. Jen was about to tell Tyler that this would be a good place to arrange a tow when she noticed something odd. In the center of town, where the main street intersected with Highway 59, there was a diner. Not unusual in itself. Small towns across America had diners like this. Chrome-sided buildings with neon signs, holdovers from the 1950s. But Jen was certain she'd driven through Latimer dozens of times before, and she'd never seen this diner. The sign above it read, "The Last Stop Diner," in bright red neon that seemed too vivid, too saturated, like a color that shouldn't exist in nature. Below that, a smaller sign flickered. "Open 24 hours. "Huh," Tyler said. "That's new. I came through here this afternoon, and I swear that wasn't there." A chill ran down Jen's spine. "You came through here earlier today?" "Yeah, around 4 o'clock. I remember because I stopped at that gas station." He pointed to a darkened Shell station across the street. "And I thought about getting food, but there weren't any restaurants. Just some closed-up buildings and a Dollar General." Jen slowed the truck. Tyler was right. There shouldn't be a diner here. But there it was, bright and inviting, with lights blazing in every window, and what looked like customers visible through the glass. "You hungry?" Tyler asked. "I could eat. My treat, for the ride." Jen knew she should keep driving. Every instinct honed by 8 years on the road was screaming at her that something was wrong with this place. But she was also exhausted, and the thought of hot coffee and food was deeply appealing. Besides, there were clearly other people inside. How dangerous could it be? "Sure," she heard herself say, "but I'm buying. You're a broke college kid." She pulled into the diner's parking lot, noting that it was oddly empty except for a handful of cars. A 1980s Cadillac, a 1990s Ford pickup, a Honda Accord that might have been from the early 2000s. All of them looked dusty and weathered, as if they'd been sitting in this lot for years rather than hours. Inside, the diner was decorated in classic Americana style. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkerboard floor, a long counter with rotating stools, and a jukebox in the corner currently silent. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. A waitress stood behind the counter, middle-aged, with teased blonde hair, and a name tag that read Dolores. She smiled as they entered, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Take any seat, hun," she called out. "Menus are on the tables. I'll be right with you." Jen and Tyler slid into a booth near the window. Jen picked up the laminated menu, noting that the prices seemed stuck in some earlier decade. Coffee for 50 cents, burgers for $2, a full breakfast for $3.50. She glanced around at the other customers. There were 5 of them scattered throughout the diner. An elderly couple in a corner booth, holding hands across the table and staring at their coffee without drinking. A lone man at the counter, 50-ish, wearing a trucker's cap and a jacket with a logo Jen didn't recognize. 2 women in another booth, both in their 30s, speaking to each other in whispers that Jen couldn't quite hear. What struck Jen as odd was how still they all were. The couple hadn't moved since she'd entered. The man at the counter hadn't lifted his coffee cup. The 2 women were whispering, but their lips barely moved, and their expressions never changed. "Jen," Tyler said quietly, "does something feel weird to you?" "Yeah," she replied, keeping her voice low. "Yeah, it does." Dolores approached their booth with a coffee pot and 2 mugs. She poured without asking if they wanted any, the dark liquid steaming as it filled the cups. Up close, Jen could see that Dolores's smile was fixed, frozen, like a mask someone had glued to her face. "What can I get you folks?" Dolores asked in a cheerful voice that sounded rehearsed, artificial. "Just coffee for now," Jen said. "We need a minute to decide." "Take your time," Dolores replied. "We're open all night, every night. You can stay as long as you want." She walked away, her movements smooth and mechanical, like an animatronic figure from a theme park. Jen watched her go, then leaned forward to whisper to Tyler, "We need to leave. Right now." "I was thinking the same thing," Tyler whispered back. "This place is wrong. Those people, I don't think they're really people." Before they could stand, the elderly couple in the corner booth turned their heads in perfect unison to look at Jen and Tyler. Their eyes were completely white, no pupils, no irises, just blank white orbs that should have been sightless, but were clearly focused on the newcomers. "New arrivals," the elderly woman said in a voice like rustling paper. "It's been so long since we had new arrivals." The man at the counter rotated on his stool, and he too had those terrible white eyes. "Travelers," he said. "Lost travelers. That's what this place is for. That's what we all are." Jen grabbed Tyler's arm and started to slide out of the booth, but found she couldn't move. It was as if the vinyl seat had developed adhesive properties, holding them in place. Tyler pushed against the table, trying to force himself free, but he too was stuck. Dolores returned, still wearing that fixed smile. Now, she said, in her artificially cheerful voice. "You haven't even ordered yet. You can't leave without ordering. That's the rule. Everyone who comes to the last stop has to order." "Let us go," Jen demanded, fighting down the panic rising in her chest. "We don't want anything. We're leaving." "But you came inside," Dolores said, and for the first time, Jen saw an expression flicker across her face. Not quite sadness, not quite pity, but something in between. "You saw the sign. You pulled into the parking lot. You walked through the door. That means you're ours now. That means you stay." The 2 women from the other booth approached, moving in that same smooth, mechanical way. Up close, Jen could see that their eyes were white like the others, and their skin had an odd texture, like wax that had started to melt and then solidified again. "We were travelers too," one of them said. "I was driving through Oklahoma in 2003. I saw the diner, Thought I'd stop for coffee. That was 17 years ago. I came through in 1998, the other woman added. On my way to Texas. I've been here ever since. Tyler's breathing had become rapid and shallow. What is this place? What does it want from us? The elderly man stood and walked over, his movements stiff, as if his joints no longer worked properly. It's a trap, he said simply. A trap for travelers, for people who are between places, between destinations. The diner appears on lonely roads, in small towns, calling to people who are tired or hungry or lonely. And when they stop, when they come inside, it keeps them. For how long? Jen asked, though she dreaded the answer. Forever, the elderly woman replied. She had joined her husband, and they stood side by side, their white eyes fixed on Jen with what might have been sympathy. Or until the diner decides to let you go. We don't know which. We've been here since 1987. 33 years of sitting in the same booth, drinking coffee that never gets cold, eating food that never fills you up. Jen looked around the diner with new understanding. This wasn't a restaurant. It was a prison, a supernatural trap that captured travelers and held them indefinitely. The cheerful decor, the smell of food, the warm lighting, all of it was a lure, designed to draw in people who were vulnerable, tired, displaced. There has to be a way out, Tyler said desperately. There's always a way out. Dolores laughed, and it was the most human sound Jen had heard from her. Oh, honey, don't you think we've tried? Every door leads back inside. Every window won't break. Time doesn't work right here. The sun never rises. The night never ends. We're stuck in a moment, a single, endless moment, and we can't get out. Jen felt tears stinging her eyes. She thought of her son, waiting for her call that would never come. She thought of her husband, who would report her missing, who would spend years wondering what had happened to her. She thought of her life, her future, all of it vanishing because she'd made the mistake of stopping at the wrong diner. Please, she whispered, not sure who she was addressing. Dolores, the other trapped travelers, whatever malevolent intelligence controlled this place. Please, let us go. We didn't mean to intrude. We'll leave and never speak of this place. The diner seemed to consider this. The lights flickered, and for a moment, Jen thought she could see through the walls, could see the true nature of the structure they were trapped in. It wasn't a diner at all. It was something vast and incomprehensible, something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, something that fed on the temporally displaced, on people who were between one place and another. Then the moment passed, and they were back in the cheerful retro diner with its trapped occupants and its false waitress. Order, Dolores said, and her voice had changed. It was deeper now, layered, as if multiple entities were speaking through her. You must order. That's the rule. You came inside, so you must order. Choose something from the menu, or choose to stay here forever, unable to decide. Jen looked down at the menu with trembling hands. She understood now. This was the mechanism of the trap. You had to engage with the illusion, had to participate in the fiction of the diner being real. But once you ordered, once you accepted food from this place, you were truly bound. The coffee they'd been given hadn't been drunk yet, and that was the only thing keeping them from being completely captured. What if we refuse? Jen asked. What if we don't order and don't drink the coffee? Then you stay in this state, the elderly man said, partially caught, unable to leave but not fully trapped. You'll sit in that booth, making your decision for eternity. That's what happened to most of us. We ordered because we thought it might free us. It didn't. It just made the trap more complete. Tyler was crying now, tears streaming silently down his face. I was just trying to get home for Thanksgiving. I just wanted to see my family. Something in Jen hardened at that. This kid, this earnest, kind kid who reminded her so much of her own son, didn't deserve this fate. Hell, none of them deserved it. How many people had been trapped here over the decades? How many travelers had made the simple, innocent mistake of stopping for coffee and found themselves lost in a supernatural prison? No, Jen said firmly. She pushed against the booth again, putting all her strength into it. No, I'm not accepting this. I'm not letting you keep us. You don't have a choice, Dolores said, but Jen heard uncertainty in her voice now. There's always a choice, Jen replied. She turned to Tyler. Don't drink the coffee, don't order anything, and don't accept this place's logic. It wants us to believe we're trapped, but we're only trapped if we agree to be. That's not how it works, one of the white-eyed women protested. We've all tried that. Belief doesn't matter. The diner's power is absolute. Is it? Jen challenged. Then why are you all trying so hard to convince us to give up? If the trap was perfect, you wouldn't need to persuade us of anything. She stood, and though it felt like she was lifting a tremendous weight, like the booth was actively trying to hold her, she managed it. Tyler saw what she was doing and struggled to his feet as well. They stood side by side, facing Dolores and the other trapped travelers. We're leaving, Jen announced. We're walking out that door, getting in my truck, and driving away. And we're not coming back. You can't, Dolores said, but her voice was fading, becoming less substantial. Watch us, Jen replied. She took Tyler's hand and walked toward the door. Each step felt like moving through molasses, but she forced herself forward, refused to stop. Behind them she could hear the other travelers murmuring in surprise, and something that might have been hope. When they reached the door, Jen half expected it to be locked or to lead somewhere impossible. But when she pushed it open, cold November air rushed in, real and genuine, and carrying the smell of the Oklahoma night. Her truck was still there in the parking lot, exactly where she'd left it. They ran. Jen didn't look back until they were both in the truck, with the doors locked. Through the windshield, she could see the diner, but it was changing. The bright neon was flickering and fading. The walls were becoming translucent, and she could see the trapped travelers inside, still sitting at their tables, still frozen in their eternal moment. Then, as Jen started the engine and began to pull out of the parking lot, something remarkable happened. The elderly couple stood and walked toward the door. Then the man in the trucker's cap. Then the two women. One by one, the trapped travelers were moving, following the path Jen and Tyler had blazed. In her rearview mirror, as she accelerated back onto Highway 59, Jen saw them emerging from the diner. 6 people, blinking in confusion, looking around at a world they hadn't seen in years or decades. And behind them, the last stop diner was collapsing in on itself, the false structure dissolving like mist in sunlight. Did we just... Tyler couldn't finish the sentence. Yeah, Jen replied, her voice shaking with adrenaline and relief. I think we did. I think we freed them. They drove in silence for several miles, both of them trying to process what had happened. Finally, Tyler spoke again. Why did it work? Why were we able to leave when they couldn't? Jen thought about it. I think because we didn't accept it. The others, they'd been there so long. They'd started to believe the trap was real, was absolute. But we still had fresh eyes. We could still see that it was all illusion, all manipulation. And once we rejected that, once we refused to play by the diner's rules, the whole structure fell apart. "Will it come back?" Tyler asked. "Will it appear somewhere else, trap more people?" "Maybe," Jen admitted. "Or maybe we damaged it enough that it's gone for good. I don't know. But if I ever see another diner that doesn't belong, that appears where there should be nothing, I'm going to drive right past it. And you should too." They reached the next town over, a place called Wilson that Jen actually recognized from previous trips. She helped Tyler arrange for a tow truck to retrieve his motorcycle, bought him dinner at a completely normal, non-supernatural diner, and made sure he had enough money for a bus ticket home. As they said goodbye in the bus station parking lot, Tyler gave her a fierce hug. "You saved my life," he said. "Thank you." "You helped save your own life," Jen corrected. "And maybe 6 others. That's not bad for a night's work." She watched him walk into the station, then climbed back into her truck. She had a schedule to keep, a load to deliver in Houston. But as she pulled back onto the highway, Jen made a mental note to add a new entry to her catalog of truck stops and rest areas. The Last Stop Diner, somewhere in Oklahoma. Don't stop. Don't ever stop. Years later, Jen would sometimes wonder if that night had really happened, or if she'd hallucinated the whole thing from exhaustion. But then she'd check her phone and find Tyler's contact information, and she'd see his occasional text messages updating her on his life. Graduated from college, got a job in Austin, got married. And she'd know it was real. The diner had been real, and so had their escape. And somewhere out there, 6 people who'd been trapped for decades were rebuilding their lives, reconnecting with families who'd given them up for lost, trying to adjust to a world that had moved on without them. And that made every strange, terrifying moment of that November night worth it. Story 5. The Mirror Route. Vincent Delgado had been a professional driver for transcontinental freight for 15 years, and in that time, he'd developed certain rituals. He always called his daughter before starting a night drive. He always kept a rosary hanging from his rearview mirror, a gift from his late mother. And he never, ever picked up hitchhikers after the incident in Arizona 3 years ago, an encounter with a meth-addicted drifter that had ended with Vincent filing a police report and replacing his slashed seat cushions. But on a clear March evening in 2022, while driving through Montana on Interstate 90, Vincent broke his rule, and by doing so, he discovered that some roads go places they shouldn't, and some hitchhikers aren't trying to reach any destination in our world. The hitchhiker appeared just after sunset, standing beside a nondescript white sedan with its hood up, roughly 10 miles east of Billings. The man wore business casual clothing, khaki pants, a blue button-down shirt, polished shoes, which immediately struck Vincent as unusual. Hitchhikers typically looked transient, worn down. This man looked like he'd just stepped out of an office building. Vincent's initial instinct was to drive past, to honor his no hitchhikers policy. But something about the situation nagged at him. The white sedan's license plate was missing, and the man himself stood with an odd stillness, not waving for help or showing any sign of distress. He simply stood there, facing the highway, as if waiting for a specific vehicle. Against his better judgment, Vincent pulled over. "You need assistance?" Vincent called through his window. The man turned, and Vincent got his first clear look at his face. He was perhaps 40, with neatly trimmed hair and features that were almost too symmetrical, too perfect, as if he'd been designed rather than born. His eyes were his most striking feature, pale gray, almost colorless, with an intensity that made Vincent uncomfortable. "My car broke down," the man said, gesturing to the sedan. "I've been waiting for someone to stop. Would you be willing to give me a ride to the next town?" His voice was oddly flat, lacking the warmth or relief Vincent would expect from someone stranded. But Vincent had already committed to stopping, and he wasn't the kind of person to leave someone stranded just because they seemed a little off. "Sure, climb in. I'm heading toward Hardin. That work for you?" "Perfectly," the man replied, and something about the way he said it made Vincent's scalp prickle. The man climbed into the passenger seat with smooth, economical movements. He didn't bring any belongings, didn't grab a phone or wallet from the disabled sedan. He simply sat down, fastened his seatbelt, and folded his hands in his lap. "I'm Vincent," Vincent offered, pulling back onto the interstate. "I know," the man said. Vincent's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I didn't tell you my name." "No," the man agreed, "but I know it anyway. Just as I know you have a daughter named Maria, 17 years old, a junior in high school in Seattle. You're divorced from her mother, Catherine. You're 49 years old. You have a scar on your left shoulder from a motorcycle accident when you were 23. Should I continue?" Ice flooded Vincent's veins. "How the hell do you know all that?" "Because," the man said calmly, "I'm you." Vincent's first reaction was to laugh, a nervous bark of disbelief. "That's ridiculous. You look nothing like me." "I didn't say I was you from this version of the road," the man replied. "I said I was you. From the mirror route. The other Interstate 90, the one that runs parallel to this one, slightly displaced in space and possibility." Vincent wanted to pull over, wanted to throw this lunatic out of his truck immediately. But his hands continued steering. His foot remained steady on the accelerator. Some part of him, some irrational, instinct-driven part, wanted to hear more. "There are multiple versions of this highway," the man continued. "Multiple versions of this entire reality, actually. But the highways are where the barriers are thinnest. Interstate 90 has at least 7 distinct variations that I'm aware of. This one, where you're driving right now, is the primary route, what you'd consider baseline reality. But there are others, Mirror Route Alpha, Mirror Route Beta, and so on. Slightly different versions of the same road, existing in adjacent dimensional spaces." "That's insane," Vincent said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" The man, the other Vincent, tilted his head. "Then explain this. 3 years ago, you picked up a hitchhiker in Arizona. Meth addict, violent, slashed your seats. That happened on this route, in this reality. But on Mirror Route Alpha, you never picked him up. You drove past. Your seats are intact. And on Mirror Route Beta, you did pick him up, but he pulled a knife and stabbed you. You bled out on Highway 17 and died." Vincent's mouth went dry. "How could you possibly know about Arizona?" "Because I experienced variations of it. I've been traversing the mirror routes for... I'm not sure how long anymore. Time works differently when you're between realities. But I started on a route similar to this one, and through a series of choices, or perhaps mistakes, I became unstuck. Now I exist in the spaces between the highways, riding from one version to another, trying to find my way home." The landscape outside the windows was beginning to look wrong. Vincent noticed it slowly at first. The spacing of the telephone poles seemed different, slightly irregular. The mountains in the distance had a subtly altered profile, and the sky was the wrong shade of blue, deeper and more saturated than it should be at dusk. "What's happening?" Vincent demanded. We're transitioning, the other Vincent said, moving from your primary route onto one of the mirror routes. It happens when two versions of the same person occupy the same vehicle. The reality can't sustain that paradox, so it shifts us elsewhere. The transition accelerated. The road ahead began to shimmer like heat haze, and through the distortion, Vincent could see that the highway was changing. The asphalt was darker, almost black. The lane markings were a different color, not white and yellow, but silver and red. And the vehicles passing in the opposite direction were wrong. Cars with designs Vincent had never seen. Trucks with configurations that seemed impractical or impossible. "Make it stop," Vincent said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Whatever you're doing, make it stop." "I can't," the other Vincent replied. And for the first time, Vincent heard emotion in his voice. Sadness, exhaustion. "I've been trying to stop it for months, maybe years. But once you're on the mirror routes, once you start sliding between realities, you can't anchor yourself. You just keep moving, keep shifting, watching infinite variations of your life play out in infinite versions of the world." The transition completed. One moment they were on Interstate 90 as Vincent knew it, and the next they were somewhere else. A highway that resembled I-90, but was fundamentally different. The sky was now a deep purple, streaked with clouds that moved in geometric patterns, like something painted by an artist who'd never seen real weather. The landscape was Montana, but a Montana that had developed differently. Strange architecture visible in the distance, roads that curved in ways that didn't quite obey Euclidean geometry. "Welcome to Mirror Route Delta," the other Vincent said quietly. "I've been here before. It's one of the more stable variations. Some of them are less pleasant." Vincent tried his CB radio, but it produced only static, occasionally interrupted by voices speaking languages he didn't recognize. His GPS showed their location as exactly where they should be on Interstate 90, but the map display flickered and glitched, showing roads that appeared and disappeared, towns with names that changed each time he looked. "How many versions of me are there?" Vincent asked. "Infinite," the other Vincent replied. "Every choice creates branches, creates new variations. In some realities, you never became a trucker. In others, you died young. In still others, you made completely different choices and became completely different people. But there are certain convergence points, certain versions that are more stable, more similar to each other. I'm one of those. Close enough to you in circumstances and choices that we resonate, that we draw each other across dimensional barriers." Vincent looked at his passenger more carefully. Now that they were on the mirror route, he could see similarities he'd missed before. The shape of the nose was right. The way the man held his shoulders. Even the voice, underneath the flatness, had a familiar timbre. "If you're me," Vincent said slowly, "then how did you end up like this? What choices did you make that I didn't?" The other Vincent was quiet for a long moment. "I picked up a hitchhiker," he finally said, 7 months ago on my version of I-90. A man who claimed he could show me something incredible, something that would change how I saw the world. And he did. He showed me the mirror routes. He opened my eyes to the multiplicities of reality. And once I'd seen them, I couldn't unsee them. I started slipping between routes, unable to hold on to any single version. I've been wandering ever since, occasionally manifesting on primary routes like yours, trying to warn other versions of myself not to make the same mistake. "But I just picked you up," Vincent protested. "You just showed me the mirror routes. Does that mean I'm going to end up like you?" I don't know, the other Vincent admitted. Maybe. Or maybe because I warned you, you'll be able to anchor yourself better than I could. That's what I'm hoping for anyway. That one version of us can learn from the mistakes of another. The truck crested a hill, and Vincent saw something that made him slam on the brakes. Below them, where the highway should have continued toward Hardin, there was an intersection, but an intersection of dozens of roads, all converging on a single point. Some of the roads were normal asphalt highways. Others were made of materials Vincent couldn't identify. One appeared to be constructed of glass or crystal. Another seemed to be paved with something that looked like liquid silver. And on each of these roads, Vincent could see vehicles, some familiar, others bizarre and impossible. This is the convergence, the other Vincent said. The point where multiple mirror roads come together. It's the most dangerous place in the system because the boundaries between realities are almost non-existent here. If you're not careful, you can slip from one route to another with every heartbeat, fragmenting yourself across dozens of timelines simultaneously. How do I avoid it? Vincent asked desperately. You don't. Not now. We're already here. But you can navigate through it if you're strong enough, if you can hold on to your sense of self. Pick one road, the one that feels most right, most real, and commit to it completely. Don't second guess. Don't look at the alternatives. Just drive. Vincent stared at the impossible intersection, trying to identify which road was his, which one would take him back to primary reality. They all looked equally real and unreal at the same time. How was he supposed to choose? Then he remembered his rituals, the things that grounded him on every drive. He'd called Maria before this trip, had told her he loved her. His mother's rosary was still hanging from the rearview mirror, the beads clicking softly together with the motion of the truck. These were his anchors, his connections to his specific version of reality. Vincent focused on the rosary, on the memory of his mother pressing it into his hand before she died. He thought about Maria, about her laugh, about the way she'd roll her eyes at his dad jokes. He thought about his life, not some idealized alternative version, but his real, messy, imperfect life, with its mistakes and regrets and small joys. And then he saw it, one of the roads ahead, slightly more solid than the others, slightly more real. It was Interstate 90 as he knew it, regular black asphalt with white and yellow markings, leading toward Hardin under a normal evening sky. That one, Vincent said, pointing. Are you sure? The other Vincent asked. I'm sure. Vincent pressed down on the accelerator and aimed for that road, that specific version of reality. As the truck descended toward the convergence, the other roads seemed to fade, becoming translucent, ghost-like. The one he'd chosen grew more solid, more substantial. The moment they entered the convergence itself, Vincent felt a terrible pulling sensation, as if his body were being torn in multiple directions simultaneously. He heard voices, his own voice, multiplied hundreds or thousands of times, each one slightly different, each one calling out from a different version of his life. Some were happy, some were screaming, some were speaking words he couldn't understand, but he held on to his anchors. Maria, his mother's rosary, his life, his specific, singular existence. He kept his eyes on the road he'd chosen and refused to look at the alternatives. And slowly, gradually, the pulling eased. The other roads faded away completely. The sky returned to its normal color. The landscape became recognizable Montana, with familiar mountains and normal-looking towns in the distance. They were back. Vincent pulled onto the shoulder and put the truck in park with shaking hands. He turned to look at his passenger and found that the other Vincent was no longer quite as solid as he'd been. He was becoming transparent, fading like morning mist. "You did it," the other Vincent said, and there was genuine happiness in his voice. "You anchored yourself. You're going to be okay." "What about you?" Vincent asked. "What happens to you now?" "I keep searching. Keep riding the mirror routes, looking for a way home. Maybe I'll find it. Maybe I won't. But at least I know that one version of me made it back, made the right choice." He smiled, and in that smile, Vincent saw his own face, his own soul. "Take care of Maria. Tell her you love her every chance you get, and never ever pick up another hitchhiker who seems to know too much about you." "Wait," Vincent said, reaching out, but his hand passed through the other Vincent's shoulder. "Is there anything I can do to help you?" The other Vincent shook his head. "Just live well. Live the life I can't anymore. That's enough." And then he was gone, vanished completely, leaving Vincent alone in the cab of his truck on the shoulder of Interstate 90, 10 miles outside of Hardin, Montana. The white sedan the hitchhiker had been standing beside was nowhere to be seen, as if it had never existed. Vincent sat there for a long time, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, processing what had happened. Had it been real? Had he really traveled to mirror routes and back? Or had he experienced some kind of breakdown, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or stress? But when he looked at the odometer, he'd traveled 60 miles more than should have been possible in the time that had passed. And when he checked his CB radio, the channels were filled with normal trucker chatter. But occasionally, just occasionally, he'd hear fragments of other conversations, voices discussing impossible things in the gaps between transmissions, echoes from the mirror routes bleeding through. Vincent pulled back onto the highway and continued toward his destination. He delivered his load on time, called Maria from every stop, and tried to return to normal life. But sometimes, late at night, when he was driving through empty stretches of highway, he'd see things out of the corner of his eye, roads that shouldn't exist, vehicles that obeyed different laws of physics, versions of himself in the mirrors of passing trucks. And he'd tighten his grip on the steering wheel, focus on his anchors, Maria's voice, his mother's rosary, the specific details of his life, and stay firmly on his own route, his own reality. He never picked up another hitchhiker, and whenever he saw someone stranded on the roadside, he'd call it in to highway patrol, but keep driving. Because Vincent Delgado had learned a terrible truth. Some hitchhikers aren't trying to reach a destination. They're trying to find a reality they can call home. And if you're not careful, they'll take you with them, out onto roads that stretch across infinite variations of existence, where you can wander forever and never find your way back. Story 6. The Grateful Passenger. Thomas Wright had been a long-haul driver for 23 years, and in that time, he'd developed a reputation among other drivers for being unnaturally lucky. He'd never had a serious accident, never been robbed, never encountered any of the horror stories that seemed to plague other truckers. When asked about his good fortune, Thomas would just shrug and say he tried to do right by people, help when he could, and karma took care of the rest. But on a humid August night in 2019, while driving through rural Georgia on Highway 341, Thomas discovered that karma was more complex than he'd imagined, and that some debts get repaid in ways that reshape reality itself. The hitchhiker appeared around 10 p.m., illuminated by Thomas's headlights as he rounded a curve. She was young, maybe 18, wearing a white sundress that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her car, a beaten-down Toyota Corolla, sat on the shoulder, with steam rising from under the hood. Thomas slowed immediately. He'd picked up countless hitchhikers over his career, and most of those encounters had been utterly mundane. Someone needed a ride. He provided it. They went their separate ways. But something about this young woman set off alarm bells in Thomas's head. She stood too still, and her expression, even visible from a distance, was wrong. Not afraid or frustrated, as he'd expect from someone with a broken-down car, but rather vacant, empty. Thomas should have driven past. Every instinct told him to keep going, call highway patrol to check on her, but don't stop. Yet his foot moved to the brake seemingly of its own accord, and the truck rolled to a stop 30 yards past the Toyota. The young woman walked toward him with an odd, gliding gait, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground. When she reached his passenger door and looked up at him, Thomas saw that her eyes were glassy, unfocused, like someone heavily medicated or in shock. "Are you okay?" Thomas called down to her. "Help me," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Please, help me." "He's coming back." Thomas's protective instincts overrode his caution. "Who's coming back? Is someone after you?" "Please," she repeated, and now there was desperation in her voice. "Please let me in. He's coming." Thomas unlocked the passenger door, and the young woman climbed in with surprising speed. Up close, he could see that she was terrified. Her hands were shaking, and her breathing was rapid and shallow. Whatever had put her in this state, it was real and immediate. "What's your name?" Thomas asked as he pulled back onto the highway, accelerating quickly. "Sarah," she managed. "Sarah Keller. I was driving from Athens to my parents' house in Macon. There was a man in the back seat. I don't know how he got there. I stopped for gas 20 miles back, and when I got back to my car, he was just there, hiding in the back. He waited until I was on an empty stretch of road. Then he grabbed me." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Did he hurt you?" "He tried to. I fought him, scratched his face. When he stopped to change a tire, I'd run over some glass he'd thrown on the road. I ran. But he's looking for me. He said he'd find me. He said I couldn't get away." Fresh tears streamed down her face. "I've been hiding in the woods for hours. My phone is still in the car with him. I was so scared no one would stop." "You're safe now," Thomas assured her, though his eyes kept flicking to his mirrors, looking for pursuing headlights. "I'm going to get you to the police in Macon. They'll handle this." Sarah nodded, hugging herself. Thank you so much. I thought I was going to die tonight." They drove in silence for several miles. Thomas radioed ahead to a truck stop in Macon, asking them to have police ready. He gave Sarah water from his cooler and tried to keep her calm, talking about neutral things, his family, his years on the road. As they approached the outskirts of Macon, Sarah finally seemed to relax slightly. "I don't know how to repay you," she said. "You saved my life tonight." "You don't need to repay anything," Thomas replied. "I'm just glad I was there." Sarah turned to look at him directly, and Thomas noticed that her eyes had changed. They were no longer glassy and traumatized, but rather clear and penetrating, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "But I do need to repay you," she said softly. "That's how it works. You saved me, so I save you. A debt for a debt. A life for a life." Before Thomas could respond, he heard a sound that made his blood turn to ice. A siren, followed by flashing red and blue lights in his side mirror. A police cruiser had appeared behind him, signaling him to pull over. "That's good," Thomas said. though something felt wrong about the timing. "We can report what happened to you right now." But Sarah's expression had changed to one of sorrow. "Thomas, that's not a real police car. That's him. The man who attacked me. He has a portable siren and light bar. He uses them to pull over women traveling alone." Thomas's stomach dropped. He pressed down on the accelerator, the truck's engine roaring as he sped up. The police car, if Sarah was right, the fake police car, matched his speed, staying close behind him. "This is insane," Thomas said. "How is this happening?" "Because it's supposed to," Sarah replied cryptically. "Tonight was supposed to end with me dead on the side of Highway 341. But you changed that. You saved me. And now the timeline is trying to correct itself." "What are you talking about?" Thomas demanded. But even as he spoke, he noticed something impossible. The highway ahead was changing. The road that should have led straight into Macon was instead curving away, leading into darkness, into territory Thomas didn't recognize, despite having driven this route hundreds of times. "The universe has patterns," Sarah explained, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "Certain events are meant to happen. Tonight I was meant to die. But you interfered with that pattern, and when you interfere with death, death finds someone else to balance the scales." The fake police car was getting closer, pulling alongside the truck. Thomas glanced over and saw the driver, a man with a scarred face, grinning maniacally, mouthing words that Thomas couldn't hear but could understand anyway. "You're next." "What do I do?" Thomas shouted, fear overwhelming him. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, and where she touched him, Thomas felt a warmth spread through his body. "You already did it," she said. "You saved me. And because you saved me, I can save you. That's the only way to break the cycle. Gratitude creates a shield that even death can't penetrate easily." The highway ahead split, forking in two directions. One route led into absolute darkness, into what Thomas somehow knew was oblivion. The other route, fainter, barely visible, led back toward the lights of Macon. "Take the right fork," Sarah instructed. "Drive toward the light, and don't look at him. Don't acknowledge his existence. Focus only on moving forward." Thomas wrenched the steering wheel to the right, taking the fainter path. The fake police car tried to follow, but as Thomas committed to that route, the darkness seemed to close in around his pursuer. Through his mirror, he saw the car being swallowed by shadows, the driver's grin changing to an expression of fury, and then fear before disappearing completely. The truck emerged back onto familiar Highway 341, the lights of Macon visible ahead. The clock on Thomas's dashboard showed that only minutes had passed since he'd picked up Sarah, though it felt like hours. "What just happened?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. Sarah smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "You saved me from a predator, from a man who's killed 6 women using his fake police car routine. And I saved you from becoming his 7th victim. Because yes, Thomas, he was going to come after you next after dealing with me. He doesn't like witnesses." "But how did you know all that? How did you make the road change?" "Because I'm not just Sarah Keller, a college student from Athens." Her form began to shimmer, becoming less solid. "I'm also something else. Something that travels these highways, looking for moments where kindness can prevent tragedy. When you stopped to help me, you created a chain of gratitude that's more powerful than any curse or pattern. You changed fate." Thomas stared as Sarah became increasingly translucent. "Are you even real? Did any of this happen?" "I'm real," Sarah assured him. "The attack was real. Your rescue was real, and the debt I owed you was real. What happens next is also real. You're going to live a long life, Thomas Wright. No accidents, no robberies, no tragedies. Because you helped someone when you didn't have to. Because you put yourself at risk for a stranger. That kind of goodness creates ripples that protect you. But what about you? Thomas asked. If I saved you, what happens to you now? Sarah's smile widened. I get to move on. I get to be free. For years I've been bound to this highway, reliving my death over and over, waiting for someone brave enough to break the cycle. You did that. You saved me in a way no one else could. She was almost completely gone now, just a shimmer of light in the passenger seat. Take care, Thomas, and keep helping people. Keep being the kind of person who stops for strangers. The universe needs more people like you. Then she vanished entirely, leaving Thomas alone in his truck, pulling into the truck stop in Macon, where police were waiting as he'd requested. But there was no Sarah to report about, no attack to describe. The officers looked at him with confusion when he tried to explain, eventually chalking it up to a miscommunication and sending him on his way. That night, unable to sleep, Thomas looked up Sarah Keller online. What he found made his hands tremble. A news article from 2015, 4 years earlier. Sarah Keller, 18 years old, had been found dead on Highway 341 in rural Georgia, victim of a man with a fake police car who was never caught. The case had gone cold, but according to the date on Thomas's phone, it was now August 2019. If Sarah had died in 2015, how had he just spent the evening with her? Had it been a ghost, a vision, some kind of temporal anomaly? Thomas never found a satisfactory answer to those questions. But from that night forward, his luck became even more pronounced. Situations that should have led to accidents somehow resolved themselves. Dangerous drivers swerved away from him at the last moment. Mechanical failures that could have been catastrophic instead manifested as minor inconveniences that were easy to fix. And on clear nights, when he was driving through rural Georgia, Thomas would sometimes see a young woman in a white sundress standing on the side of Highway 341, waving at passing trucks. She was never there when he looked back in his mirrors, but he knew who she was. Sarah Keller, no longer trapped in the cycle of her death, finally at peace and helping to guide other travelers to safety. Thomas never spoke about that night to anyone. Who would believe him? But he kept helping people, kept stopping for stranded motorists, kept being the kind of driver who would pick up a terrified hitchhiker without hesitation. Because Thomas Wright understood something that most people never learn. Gratitude creates chains of protection that can break even death's patterns. Save someone, and perhaps, just perhaps, you save yourself in the process. And in a world full of darkness and predators, that kind of goodness might be the most powerful force there is. Story 7. The Last Delivery. Raymond Garcia had been driving for Sentinel Transport for 31 years, longer than many of his colleagues had been alive. At 63, he was one of the oldest active long-haul drivers on the West Coast routes, and he'd seen enough strange things during his decades on the road that very little surprised him anymore. But on his final scheduled run before retirement, a simple delivery from Sacramento to Reno in October 2021, Raymond encountered something that made him question everything he thought he knew about highways, death, and the nature of final journeys. The Hitchhiker appeared about 40 miles east of Sacramento, on Highway 50, where it begins its climb into the Sierra Nevada. It was just after 9 p.m., and a light rain was falling, the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything slick and treacherous. Raymond spotted the figure standing beside a black Honda motorcycle that had clearly gone down. The bike was lying on its side, and the rider's helmet was cracked. The hitchhiker was a young man, maybe 25, wearing a leather jacket and jeans. As Raymond's headlights swept over him, the man turned, and Raymond saw blood on his face. Not a lot, but enough to indicate he'd been hurt in the crash. Raymond pulled over immediately. In 31 years, he'd never passed an injured person, and he wasn't about to start now, especially on his last run. He grabbed his first aid kit and climbed down from his Peterbilt. "You okay?" Raymond called out as he approached. The young man nodded slowly, though his movements seemed uncertain. "I think so. I hit a patch of oil or something, went down. My head's ringing, but I don't think anything's broken." "Let me take a look at you," Raymond said, pulling out his flashlight. He examined the cut on the young man's forehead, not deep, already clotting, and checked his pupils. They seemed responsive, though the man was clearly disoriented. "What's your name?" Raymond asked. "Alex," the young man replied. "Alex Herrera." "Well, Alex, I don't think you should be riding anymore tonight. That's a concussion for sure. Let me give you a ride to Placerville. There's a hospital there." Alex looked at his downed motorcycle with an expression of deep sadness. "I can't just leave it here. We'll call Highway Patrol, have them tow it. Your health is more important than the bike." After some persuasion, Alex agreed. He didn't take anything from the motorcycle, didn't grab a phone or wallet. Just stood, swayed slightly, and allowed Raymond to guide him to the truck. As they climbed into the cab, Raymond noticed that Alex's clothes were dry despite the rain, but he chalked it up to the leather jacket being waterproof. They pulled back onto Highway 50, climbing into the mountains. The rain intensified, and visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet. Raymond drove carefully, his experienced hands steady on the wheel. "You've been driving long?" Alex asked. 31 years. Tonight's actually my last run. I'm retiring next week." "Last run," Alex repeated, and something in his tone made Raymond glance over. The young man was staring straight ahead with an odd expression, somewhere between sadness and understanding. "Yeah, I'm 63. Time to hang it up, spend time with my grandkids, maybe travel with my wife. See things from the passenger seat for a change." "But you'll miss it," Alex said. "The road, the driving, the feeling of moving through the night with a load behind you and miles ahead. You'll miss it every day." Raymond was surprised by how accurately Alex had captured his feelings. "Yeah," he admitted. "Yeah, I will. It's been my whole life. I don't know who I am if I'm not a trucker." They drove in comfortable silence for a while. The rain continued, and the road grew steeper as they climbed into the high country. Raymond noticed that other traffic had vanished. They seemed to be the only vehicle on Highway 50, which was unusual even at this hour. "Raymond," Alex said suddenly, "I need to tell you something. About tonight." "What about it?" "About why I'm here. About what's really happening." Before Raymond could respond, the world outside the truck changed. The rain stopped instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. The darkness beyond the headlights took on a different quality. Not the natural darkness of night, but something deeper, more absolute. And the road ahead, which should have been winding upward toward Echo Summit, had become perfectly straight, stretching into the impossible distance. "What the hell?" Raymond muttered, slowing the truck. "Don't stop."